There are stories that never truly disappear, no matter how deeply people try to bury them. Time may blur memories, may turn the people involved into older, more tired versions of themselves. But time can never erase the unease that comes when a truth has been hidden, and the case we are about to step into is a part of that truth. The kind that once tore a family apart, but was left forgotten for 26 long years. The case began in a small town in the northern United States, where wooden houses sat closely together, where the backyards were always filled with the sound of children running, and where windows glowed warm every winter evening. People believed nothing truly frightening could happen here. They believed in kindness, in community, in family. But then one night, all those beliefs collapsed when a child vanished without leaving a trace. What was even more heartbreaking was that it happened inside the very home everyone thought was the safest place of all. 26 years passed. The people who once lived in that house had scattered in different directions. Some tried to rebuild their lives. Some lived with a nameless haunting, and some chose silence as the only way to save themselves. They didn't want to remember, yet they could never forget. And then one day, an old, worn-out case file surfaced again, not discovered by the police, but by a member of the family. Someone who had been carrying guilt, fear, and a quiet hunger for something that resembled justice. But what makes a person reopen a story buried for more than 2 decades? What makes them believe the truth is still somewhere out there? And why can't they keep living as if it never happened? Why, after all these years, does the pain remain unchanged, ready to surge back with just one tiny detail? Maybe it's because deep down, every human being wants to be freed. Maybe because they know a child never deserved to be forgotten like that. Or maybe because, in the end, the truth always finds a way to return, no matter how slow, no matter how painful. Today, we're not just reopening an old case file. We're stepping into a story filled with the wounds of an ordinary American family. We will hear voices that were once ignored. We will look into moments they never dared face. And we will ask ourselves whether something had been hidden since the very beginning. What do you think about a family living in silence for 26 years? What do you think when a child disappears, with no one able to answer why? And is anyone meant to carry that pain for this long? If you want us to continue unlocking each chapter of this story, make sure to follow the channel and share your thoughts right now. What do you believe truly happened inside that house on that night? Because who knows, your guess might just be the very first key to uncovering the truth buried for 26 years. When people recall the story that slept for 26 years, they often begin by telling about the family living in the little wooden house up north. An ordinary, simple American family, but one that carried fissures even close neighbors could not see. And perhaps those very cracks are what allowed everything to slip into shadow, where a child could vanish and no one could understand why. The family had 4 members. The father had been a carpenter, taciturn, sparing with words, always carrying the scent of pine and the echo of a saw after a long day's work. He was the kind of man who believed silence was a form of love, so he rarely spoke. Yet sometimes that silence made the people in the house feel abandoned. The mother was the opposite. Warm, quick to smile, she treasured the little stories that surfaced at the dinner table, trying to keep the family together with hearty meals and gentle encouragement. But everyone carries private weariness, and she was no exception. On some nights, she would sit long on the porch, looking out at the empty road without saying a word to anyone. The older child, then a teenager, was a tangle of rebellion and duty. He always wanted to prove he was strong enough to protect the younger sibling, but in truth he was lost in his own world. He often felt his parents didn't really understand him, and his friends were too busy to listen. So there were days he retreated to his room, wanting someone to ask after him, while simultaneously afraid to answer any question. And finally, the child who disappeared that night. A little one with bright eyes who always asked why. Why leaves change color, why snow falls, why parents argue, why his brother no longer wanted to play. He was the kind of child who exhausted and endeared adults at once. Perhaps for that reason, his disappearance struck the family's heart the hardest. It left a hole that would never be filled. The town where they lived stood silent as witness, a place where people knew one another across generations, a place whose mornings smelled of baked goods and whose afternoons were punctuated by the school bell, a place where justice felt self-evident and children were thought safe within the community's watchful eye. But when the disappearance happened, that faith cracked. Everyone tried to find an explanation, yet questions multiplied faster than answers. People whispered, suspected, then fell silent. In a small town, fear sometimes outweighs truth. The family became the focus of every gaze. Some felt genuine pity. Some felt compassion veiled as curiosity. Some were merely nosy. The father's silence was read as coldness. The mother's tears were labeled melodramatic. The teenager's statements were dissected word by word as if he were hiding something. But did anyone truly understand their pain? Did anyone know what it felt like to live in a house where every corner reminded you of a child who never came back? 26 years later, when the old case file was suddenly opened again, those emotions returned like a storm. The mother had grown older. Her hands trembled as she touched the yellowed pages. The father had learned to speak more, yet he did not know what to say when memories flooded back. The boy had become a grown man, carrying a burden he had never been able to set down. Each of them faced the past in a different way, but all shared the same resolve. They would not let the child in their memory be forgotten once more. And then you ask yourself, what allows a family to survive so many years of silence? What makes them choose to reopen all that pain again? Perhaps they saw something in that file. Or perhaps, simply, they could not bear to die carrying the question for a lifetime. This story is not only about a disappearance. It is about family ties, about what people try to protect, and about the invisible threads that bind those who live under the same roof. To understand the case, we must understand them every glance, every pause, every wound they dared not touch. And that is where our journey truly begins. When the old case file was reopened after 26 years, the first thing that appeared wasn't the official reports or the typed statements, it was the empty spaces. Boxes meant to be filled were left blank. Witness notes stopped mid-sentence. Some lines faded as if someone, at some point, had tried to erase them. And sometimes, emptiness speaks louder than ink. It makes people wonder, why was a missing child's case never pursued to the very end? Why did the truth shatter into scattered pieces, dulled by time yet still sharp enough to cut anyone who dared touch them? According to the file, the night it happened was colder than most winters. Wind scraped against the wooden roof, making the kind of groaning sounds that always frightened the child. His mother recalled that he clutched his stuffed bear and asked to sleep in his parents' room. She gently reassured him that everything was fine and that tomorrow they would go out for donuts, just like she had promised. That was the last time she saw him. Around 1 a.m, the father heard a faint noise in the hallway. He assumed it was the wind. Old houses often speak in strange ways on freezing nights. None of them imagined that the sound meant something they would never be able to undo. By morning, the child's room was open. The blankets were messy. The stuffed bear lay on the floor. No signs of struggle. No cries. Just absence, clean, sudden, terrifying. The local police arrived later than anyone expected. Small town. Limited staff. Everything moved with a familiar, slow rhythm. They looked for footprints, but found none. They questioned neighbors, who all insisted they slept through the night because of the howling wind. From the very beginning, the investigation resembled a loose thread pull on it, and it snapped. The strangest detail was the older brother's statement. He said he heard the back door open quietly that night. He thought it was his father stepping out to check the weather, but in the morning no one mentioned it. In the file, the question about the back door appeared only once, then was never brought up again. That missing follow-up felt like a hole in the painting, something that made the whole story pulse with unease. Years later, as an adult, the brother admitted he had seen a silhouette outside the window that night. A dark figure standing still for far too long to be just wind. But when police interviewed him again, he said he may have remembered wrong. Maybe he was afraid. Afraid of being the only one to see what everyone else had ignored. Afraid of being suspected. Or afraid of admitting that he hadn't been strong enough to protect his little brother. There was another detail in the file that troubled many. The family once had a dispute with a neighbor. A solitary man who fixed cars for a living, rarely spoke, lived a quiet but distant life. He had argued with the father over a drainage pipe between their houses. But the police removed him from the suspect list after a single short conversation. No one knew whether he had a solid alibi or whether the officers simply wanted to close a case they weren't equipped to handle. One section of the report showed the mother returning to the station week after week. She brought photos, brought hope that was slowly fraying, but received nothing more than sympathetic words. What hurt the most was a small note scribbled at the end of a page. The mother shows signs of stress. Recommend going home to rest. Perhaps it was written casually, but it became the clearest picture of what really happened. A mother begging for help, and a system that didn't look closely enough. Throughout the investigation, small clues surfaced, then vanished like snow melting on asphalt. A piece of blue fabric found near the creek behind the house. A neighbor who claimed a strange car drove slowly down the street at midnight. Nothing was pursued thoroughly. After a few months, the case was officially closed. The family was told to move on. But how do you move on when the most precious thing in your life disappears without a single answer? Everyone began living with private questions. The father tormented himself for not checking the noise. The mother blamed herself for letting her son sleep alone that night. The brother carried a guilt he never outgrew, wondering if things would have been different had he been braver. Looking at the old file now, it is clear that the story wasn't just about a missing child. It was about people trapped between grief and silence. People who didn't know who to talk to, who to blame, or how to keep living when each passing year pulled them further away from the little boy they loved. And in that silence, the case was forgotten, buried under time, covered by things left unexplained. But now, with the file reopened, old questions rise again. Questions about that winter night, about the shadow at the window, the back door left ajar, the missing details on the faded pages. And this is where we must pause and think. If a case was never investigated fully, what was left behind? If a family lived in silence for 26 years, what remains to be found? And can the truth ever be restored when memory has been twisted by pain for so long? This is where the story begins to unfold again. Not through perfect evidence, but through the emotions of the living. Not through flawless reports, but through the empty spaces waiting to be filled. And those empty spaces may be the very path leading us toward the truth buried for far too long. When we began piecing together every layer of information and comparing it with what remained in the old case file, one thing became clearer than ever. No one in that house told the full truth on the night Sarah disappeared. Each person told a slightly different version. Each detail shifted only a little. But sometimes, a little is enough because a little means someone is hiding a lot. More than 26 years later, as I met each person who once lived under that roof, I could feel something unmistakable, lingering in their expressions. Fear. Not the fear of people who lost a child, but the fear of people who carried a secret for so long that it had become part of their breathing. The first person who made the entire investigative team pause was the stepfather. In the old file, he appeared ordinary, a hard-working man, punctual, almost the template of a typical American family man in the 90s. But the more we reviewed his statements, the more things didn't align. He said he was working the night shift and wasn't home when Sarah vanished. But the factory timesheet had an inexplicable gap. No one knew when he left his shift, or why none of his co-workers saw him before he disappeared from the building. What struck me more was the way he avoided every question about Sarah. Whenever her name came up, his voice dipped for a split second, then shut down entirely, like a door slammed before anyone could step in. His eyes drifted everywhere except toward the person speaking to him, as if he feared someone might look too deeply into him. The second unsettling figure was Martha, the mother. For decades, people assumed she was simply another victim of that family's collapse. But the more we looked, the less her softness felt genuine. Her statements changed at least 3 times in the original report. At first, she said she saw Sarah go to bed. Another time, she claimed the girl stayed up late watching a movie. And on one rare occasion, she admitted she had seen Sarah crying just before the stepfather entered the room. Those inconsistencies weren't random. They carried the weight of someone trapped between two fears: the fear of the truth, and the fear of what might happen if the truth were ever spoken aloud. Some families appear calm and perfectly intact on the outside. Yet inside them storms rage every single day. This family was one of them. But the most troubling figure was Thomas, Sarah's older brother. He was 14 at the time, old enough to notice when something felt wrong. Yet his statement was too perfect, too polished, too much like something taught, rehearsed, or shaped to avoid cracking the surface. Meeting Thomas as an adult was even more revealing. He looked at me with eyes that always drifted away, as if still carrying a memory he couldn't face head-on. He insisted he slept through the night and heard nothing. But the neighbor told a different story. She remembered hearing shouting from the house close to midnight, the desperate cry of a child, and the booming voice of a man so loud her windows trembled. The truth always hides inside small details. And in this case, the small details collided in unsettling ways. The man who claimed he wasn't there was seen within a few blocks of the house. The person who swore he was asleep remembered the sound of a door closing. The one who said she heard nothing ended up mentioned in the neighbor's report. These things aren't coincidences. They are threads in a web of carefully arranged, carefully edited statements designed to hide something. The deeper we dug, the more the family dynamics revealed their complexity. The stepfather controlled the space in the house, his voice, his presence, his rules. The mother shrank herself, moving gently, silently, as if trying to avoid triggering something. And little Sarah, she kept looking for corners to disappear into. A teacher once recalled that Sarah had mentioned wanting to run away from home. At the time, no one thought of it as a plea for help. But now, it feels like the loudest warning no one listened to. That is what haunts me the most. Tragedies rarely begin with one big moment. They begin with small signs people fail to notice, or notice, but never dare to confront. Looking back at each statement, each glance, and each silence, I see only one thing clearly. Everyone in that house knew what happened that night. They just weren't ready to say it first. Because speaking the truth means facing themselves and facing the mistakes they carried for 26 years. In the next part, we'll uncover the first real clues that begin to break through this wall of silence. But before we go there, ask yourself this. Among the 3 who grew up with that secret, who fears the truth the most, and why? When we returned to the old house after more than 26 years, the atmosphere there still carried the same icy heaviness, as if time itself had refused to move inside those walls. The house stood silent and exhausted, as though it too had been holding a story that was never allowed to be spoken. The worn curtains, the cracks on the walls, the stairs that groaned under every step. Everything seemed to whisper that nothing in this house had ever truly disappeared. People had simply avoided looking at it for far too long. The first discovery came from something that seemed meaningless, an object so small anyone could overlook it if they did not know what they were searching for. While going through old belongings in the shed behind the house, I found a wooden box coated with thick dust. It was so small it could fit in the palm of a hand. No label, no markings, nothing remarkable. But when I opened it, inside was a pale blue hair clip. A simple item that most little girls would have. But that shade, that shape, those tiny patterns, that was the very hair clip Sarah wore every morning before leaving for school. The clip never appeared in the original case file. No one had ever mentioned it. And stranger still, why was it hidden in the shed? A place the stepfather kept locked for years before the family moved away. That tiny object felt deliberately placed there, like a message never delivered, or perhaps a trace left behind by someone in the process of erasing everything connected to Sarah. I held it for a long time. It felt like touching a piece of her childhood, something belonging to ordinary mornings. Sunlight, laughter, the kind of thing adults discard without thinking. But for us, it opened a new direction. In that moment, I knew Sarah's disappearance had not been a sudden event. It was the result of layered secrets, and sometimes the smallest things point the clearest path toward the truth. The second clue came from a torn notebook Thomas mentioned when we met him again. He said Sarah used to write everything in a tiny notebook: her dreams, her sadness, the things she never said out loud. His words brought back the image of a little girl sitting by the window, curled up and writing before her mother called her to dinner. What Thomas didn't expect was how his mother's face changed the moment he mentioned that notebook. Her expression froze for a second, as if she had just remembered something she wished had stayed buried. We began searching, and spent nearly 3 hours digging through the dusty attic. Finally, the notebook appeared among old boxes, yellowed pages, childish handwriting, but the final lines made me stare in silence. In a corner of a page, Sarah had written, "I'm scared of tonight. I'm scared of the footsteps outside my door. I wish I could go somewhere else." I read those words again and again, each time feeling a chill run down my spine. They weren't the fantasies of a child. They were real fear, the kind a child only writes when there is no one left to cling to. The notebook and the hair clip, two small objects like fragments of memory. But placed beside the inconsistencies in the earlier testimonies, they became pieces that changed everything. They proved Sarah had been afraid before she vanished, and that fear came from inside her own home. But that still wasn't the detail that shifted the entire case. What changed everything was the moment the forensic team examined the wall behind Sarah's bedroom. Under special lighting, a faint stain appeared so small it was nearly invisible to the naked eye. It matched the location mentioned by the neighbor who recalled the yelling that night. And after testing, the result was something no one wanted to read. It was Sarah's blood. When the technician said it, the entire room fell into heavy silence. For 26 years, everyone refused to believe the worst. But that tiny stain shattered all denial. A child had been harmed in her own room, and the family statements were nothing but a fog meant to cover the truth. I stood there for a long time staring at the wall, wondering what happened before that blood appeared. How many silent moments Sarah endured, how many signs were ignored, and how many adults chose to look away. That first discovery didn't just reopen the case, it reminded us of something painful. A small detail doesn't only change the direction of an investigation, it changes the way we see a child who had been forgotten for far too long. It forces us to ask, how many other Sarahs are out there, buried in the silence of adults? And from that moment on, the case was no longer just papers in a file. It became a reminder that the truth always exists, no matter how many years people try to bury it. When the new lead surfaced, we knew it was time to find the one person who had been closest to the house on the night Sarah disappeared. Mrs. Helen, the neighbor who lived just across the small lawn, was now over 80. She was the one who called the police the next morning, the one who heard the strange noises coming from Sarah's bedroom. But her statement had been ignored, or perhaps someone had made sure it became meaningless. We found her at the nursing home where she now lived. She sat by the window, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, her eyes clouded by age, but brightening the moment we mentioned Sarah. She wasn't like the exhausted or evasive witnesses we often met. Mrs. Helen looked as if she had been waiting her whole life to finally tell the story she had carried for more than 2 decades. She began with a long breath, as if releasing memories she feared would follow her to the end of her days. Her voice was soft as a breeze, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. There are things I never said, because no one wanted to listen. But now that someone has come back, I think it's time. She told us that, on that night, when the town sank into thick fog, she was awake baking. Older people often can't sleep, and her kitchen light stayed on during hours meant only for dreams. From her window, as she had done for years, she glanced toward Sarah's house. Then she heard a loud thud, like a door being slammed. Something falling. And then, the faint, trembling sob of a child. "I have never forgotten that sound," she said. "It wasn't a tantrum, it was fear. A plea so small, only someone as quiet as me could hear it. I knew it was Sarah." She paused. Her eyes held an old torment that even time couldn't wash away. Then she continued. After the sob, she heard a man's voice, low, irritated, pushed through clenched teeth. But it wasn't the voice of Sarah's father. She was sure of that. His voice was deeper, heavier. The one she heard that night was younger, harsher, and sounded like someone trying to hide something. We exchanged glances. Her words matched what the original case files had conveniently avoided. The older son of the family, the one who claimed he never left his room that night. A statement no one had ever truly checked. No one had noticed that in a household under constant strain, older children often carried anger adults never saw. Mrs. Helen said that the next morning she went over and knocked on their door, asking if anyone else had heard the noises. The mother answered, her face pale, her eyes swollen, but she simply said no, just no. Then, shut the door so hard the frame shook. I knew she was hiding something, Mrs. Helen whispered. That woman loved Sarah. Anyone could see that. She wasn't the kind to raise a hand against her child. But who knows what a desperate moment can make you hide? Maybe she wanted to protect someone. Maybe her oldest son. Her words chilled the room. The fragments of her memory slid perfectly into the cracks in that family's testimony. It felt like the final piece everyone had waited 26 years for, just no one had dared to place it. But what struck me the hardest wasn't the noise. It wasn't the voice. It was her last sentence. A sentence that reminded me, witnesses don't just witness the truth. They live with the fear that they were right, that they should have done more. I saw a figure walk past their back door near dawn, she said softly, tall, thin, carrying something like a bag. But I was too afraid to call anyone. I thought everything would be revealed eventually. Who could have imagined? She stopped. It's been 26 years, and I still see that shadow every time I close my eyes. Her story didn't only bring us closer to the truth. It opened up her own pain. The kind carried by someone who lived beside a tragedy but never had the strength to step inside it. Someone who spent a lifetime carrying guilt simply because she didn't speak when she needed to. We left the nursing home after sunset. The road ahead seemed longer after everything we'd heard. I thought of Mrs. Helen, of the loneliness she had shouldered, of the fear in the heart of a woman who knew too much with no one to tell. And I thought of Sarah, a child who cried in her own home. Yet, no one ever truly heard her. The buried emotions weren't just in the witness. They lived in everyone connected to that night. The mother, whose hands trembled every time she touched the case file. The father, who chose silence over truth. The teenage boy who had become a quiet man living in another state. And even in us, the ones reopening a door everyone wished had stayed closed. When we started this case, I thought we were just chasing facts. But the deeper we went, the more I realized we were walking into a world where everyone carried a version of Sarah inside them, a small silhouette haunting their lives. A wordless apology, a pain that everyone assumed would fade but still hurt as sharply as the first day. And then I understood. A witness's story doesn't just tell us what happened. It shows us what could have been prevented. It teaches us that the truth doesn't always hide in what people say it hides, in what they avoid saying, in the breath before an answer, in the glance away, in the pauses too long to be normal, and most of all, in the fear people carry for a lifetime. What Mrs. Helen shared wasn't just memory. It was the key to the most locked door of all, the door leading back to the night Sarah vanished. And once it opened, we knew nothing would ever be the same again. There are secrets that are never written into words. They float quietly in the air of an old kitchen, linger in the avoided glances at the dinner table, or cling to the worn pathways stretching along the front porch. Family secrets never explode like a crack of thunder. They seep silently into the people living inside that house, year by year, month by month, day by day, until no one can tell anymore where the truth ends and where fear, turned habit, begins. That evening, as the amber streetlights of the small town filtered through the living room window, the old witness sat across from us, her hands woven tightly together as if trying to hide something inside them. She took a deep breath and said that what she was about to reveal had never been spoken aloud. Not because there was no chance to, but because in that family, silence was law, and telling the truth was treated like a sin. She spoke of the nights when the father came home half drunk, half conscious. The whole house would freeze, bracing for a tremor no one could see. No one was allowed to make a sound. No one could drop anything. Even the faintest clink of a spoon touching the rim of a bowl could ignite his anger like a spark catching dry hay. She remembered the mother's eyes, a typical American woman, strong on the outside yet fragile inside her own home. Every time she saw her husband step through the door, the mother would gently tug her daughter's hand, signaling her to stand closer to the wall, as if the wall could shield them from a storm threatening to break loose. That girl, the main figure of this story, grew up inside that cocoon of secrets. A place filled with unwritten rules. Never cry too loudly. Never confront directly. Never ask why her mother flinched awake at night. And above all, never ask why the words, "I love you," in their house always sounded cut short, as if someone was censoring them from behind. The witness recalled the day the girl accidentally opened her father's drawer. Inside were old photographs. A woman she didn't know was standing close to her father, her hand resting on his shoulder with unsettling familiarity. In that picture, he didn't wear the hardened, exhausted expression she saw every day. He was smiling. A smile the entire family had forgotten once existed. When the girl brought the photo to her mother, the woman remained silent. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply folded the picture and placed it inside the kitchen drawer. That night, she held her daughter longer than usual, but still said nothing. Only whispered one thing. "You have to be good. Be quiet. Keep going." That family wasn't lacking in love. They just didn't know how to admit the things slowly destroying their peace. That was the real tragedy. Everyone in the house knew about the secret relationship. Everyone knew about the arguments behind the bedroom door. Everyone knew about the nights when the mother slipped outside around midnight, standing alone in the parking lot as if she needed a few more minutes of air from a life she once dreamed of but never had. But no one spoke. No one dared to speak. The witness paused for a long time before adding that when the girl was 13, her mother almost left for good. She had already packed a small suitcase. But when the girl woke up crying because she couldn't find her mother, the woman returned. She hugged her daughter tightly and said she needed to stay to protect her. That sentence became a silent key, unlocking the pain the girl carried well into adulthood, the pain of watching her mother sacrifice everything, while never understanding how her father became someone the whole family had to fear. Those secrets, the witness said, followed the girl into her grown life. They taught her to apologize even when she wasn't wrong. They pushed her to pursue perfection until it drained her. They made her believe that every disruption was somehow her fault, because years inside that house had taught her that silence was the only way to survive. What hurt the witness the most wasn't the arguments or the signs of infidelity, or even the nights the mother cried quietly in the dark. What broke her was how everyone lived like actors. The father played the role of the perfect husband for the neighbors. The mother played the role of the ideal church-going wife. And the girl was the well-behaved child everyone praised for being mature. But inside, they all knew the house had rotted long ago. They just didn't dare scrape off the paint to face the truth beneath. At the end of her story, the witness looked down at her trembling hands. She said she wished for only one thing, that someone back then had been brave enough to break the wall of silence. That if someone had spoken the first secret out loud, maybe everything would have been different. Because sometimes silence is the very thing that makes a family collapse quietly, but inevitably. Family secrets don't create loud explosions. They smolder. They burn each person from the inside out. And by the time anyone notices, everything has already turned to ash. There are truths that drift through a life like tiny shards of glass, seemingly harmless. But the moment someone steps on them, every hidden wound reveals itself. 26 years had passed, and the traces within that family seemed to have faded. Yet they had only been lying still, waiting for the right moment to rise again. When the investigators reopened the old case file, they didn't expect much. Yellowed pages, folded corners softened by time, handwritten notes that trembled as if penned during a night of exhaustion. But it was precisely those seemingly insignificant fragments that became the key to a door everyone believed had long been sealed. There was an unexplained receipt for expensive electronics, a cassette tape tucked inside an old cookie tin, a vague statement from a neighbor dismissed years ago because people assumed she had simply misheard. Individually, none of them were strong enough to form a clear lead. But together, they began to pulse with a familiar rhythm, like the faint breathing of a truth buried too long. When the witness saw the receipt, she said immediately that the father had never owned such a device. It was far beyond what he could afford, and not something he would ever buy. Yet it appeared in the house at the exact moment tensions began to escalate. That small detail made the entire room fall silent. It was like the first crack in a family's wall, barely visible, yet speaking volumes. Then came the cassette tape. Inside were only a few seconds of static, a few muffled voices captured in haste. A man's voice, low, indistinct, a woman's voice pleading for someone to stop. The sounds weren't clear enough to be evidence, but they were clear enough to send a chill through anyone listening. Because within that brief recording, you could hear the quiet panic of someone running out of hope. And then there was the neighbor's account. She said that on a summer night, she saw the mother leaving the house with red, swollen eyes. She stood outside for a long time, as if waiting for someone, but no one came. She returned home near dawn, and from that day forward, the father's temperament changed entirely. That testimony had once been dismissed for lacking relevance. But against the backdrop of all these fragments, it suddenly sharpened like a piece of a puzzle that had been there all along, waiting to be snapped into place. One detail left everyone speechless. A small piece of paper, scribbled in the mother's handwriting. The faint, fading line read, "You must live, even if I am no longer here." The note was never sent. No one knows when or why it was written, but that single sentence made the entire room feel as if it had lost a breath. Truth is like an underground river. When blocked, it doesn't disappear. It carves deeper into the earth. 26 years later, just when everyone believed the past had settled, it surged back in the most unexpected way. Not loud, not dramatic, but quietly quiet enough to make even the strongest among them bow their heads. Those scraps of evidence, once dismissed as irrelevant, had become the final voice of people who had endured far too much. And as the truth began to surface, everyone understood that justice doesn't always arrive with police sirens or heavy verdicts. Sometimes, justice simply begins by returning a voice to those who were forced into silence for far too long. There are moments when no one in the room wants to breathe too loudly, because even a single breath might shatter the silence heavy like the dust of time. During the final interrogation, the aging father sat beneath the desk lamp, his hands trembling not from age, but because he knew this was the moment he had spent half a lifetime trying to avoid. No one forced him. There were no shouting voices, no slamming of fists, only gentle questions, simple, almost casual, as if they were asking about some forgotten rainy afternoon. Yet sometimes, it is precisely these soft, unthreatening questions that force a person to confront the thing they've been running from the longest. The investigator placed the old tape, the receipt, and the handwritten note in front of him, one by one, unhurried, unjudging. And what changed the entire atmosphere wasn't the evidence itself, but the moment he saw his wife's message, "You must live, even if I am no longer here." When his eyes touched that faint line of ink, something inside him collapsed quietly, like a rotted roof giving way after a storm. He didn't cry, but no one could claim he didn't hurt. His gaze dropped to the table, fixed on some invisible point, as though he were staring directly into the years that had turned him into someone he no longer recognized. He spoke in a hoarse voice. No one could tell if it was guilt speaking, or simply the exhaustion of a man who had resisted too long. He said that night's argument was unlike any before. His wife wanted to leave. She wanted to save herself and the child. She wanted to escape the fear that had been growing inside the home. But the terror of losing the only thing he believed he had left pushed him into an eruption he would remember for the rest of his life. He said he never meant to hurt anyone. He only wanted to hold the family together. But when a person tries to grip something that is already slipping away, despair turns them into something far more dangerous than they ever imagined. He admitted that he hid everything, hid the cries, hid the truth, hid even his own fear. He said he wasn't a monster, but he also wasn't the strong man everyone believed he was. And the empty space between those two versions of himself was what swallowed his family whole. There was a moment when he paused for a long time, staring at the wall, as if he could see his wife standing there. Not blaming him, not angry, just silent. And that silence, to him, was far more terrifying than any sentence a court could give. When the investigator asked why he hadn't spoken the truth sooner, he answered with a single line that made every heart in the room fall quiet. "I thought if I stayed silent long enough, the past would eventually find a way to forgive me. But silence only makes the pain last longer." He confessed not because he was cornered, but because those tiny scraps of evidence had touched something deeper than guilt, a memory of the woman he once loved and the child he wanted to protect, but instead condemned to grow up with a void that would never fully heal. When the confession ended, the room did not erupt. No one celebrated solving the case. There was only the feeling of a heavy door finally opening, allowing everyone to look inside and understand that not every tragedy is born from evil. Sometimes it comes from people too fragile to hold on to the good things, slipping away from them. The truth, after 26 years, was no longer about punishment. It was about giving the survivors a chance to stop asking themselves what signs they missed or what they should have done differently. And in that moment, they realized that justice is not always the ending. Sometimes, it is the chance to begin again right at the place where everything was lost. When the case finally closed, no one walked out of that room feeling victorious. There was no joy, no sense of triumph, only a long silence stretching out like the road leading back to the old house, where every brick seemed to know better than anyone how quickly happiness can disappear. 26 years buried, and when the truth resurfaced, it didn't bring light with it. It came carrying the shadows of things that should have been said long ago, held long ago, forgiven long ago. The son, upon hearing the confession, didn't cry like many expected. He simply stood still for a long time, as if looking through the layers of time, searching for the silhouette of a mother his memory had preserved in fragile fragments. The breakfasts he could still recall, the moments she gently smoothed his hair, and the last time she looked at him, as though wanting to say something important, but never getting the chance. The truth helped him understand something a child should never have to understand, that sometimes adults carry fears that make them lose themselves. The father didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew an apology now would touch nothing but the air. But something in his eyes, the exhausted heaviness of a man who had lived too long with a burden, made people realize that guilt can be a room a person locks themselves inside for an entire lifetime. And strangely, when all words had been spoken, when every piece of evidence had been filed away, the only thing left echoing in that room was not footsteps, nor the rustle of papers. It was the sound of years slipping away. Years that could have been different if just one person had been brave enough to tell the truth from the beginning. This story is not just a case. It is a reminder that silence can be a wound more persistent than violence. That the things left unsaid will keep living in the dark, and darkness always knows how to make people lose their way. We grow up believing family is the safest place, yet often it is also where the pain no one dares to face is born. But there is one thing worth remembering. The truth, even when late, still has its value. It gives those who remain a chance to touch the broken pieces, lay them on the table, and decide how they want to move forward. No one can change the past, but anyone can choose to make their future different from the things that once hurt them. Later, the son said something that left everyone silent. "I wasn't looking for revenge. I just wanted to know what really happened, so I would no longer have to guess about my mother through incomplete stories." And in that sentence lies the journey of countless children who grow up with the empty spaces adults leave behind. The story ends, but its echo lingers. It rests in the understanding that each of us has a responsibility to examine how we love, how we speak our fears, how we protect our family. And sometimes, the most human thing we can do is not to be strong, but to be honest. Honest about our emotions, our mistakes, the people we love. If you've stayed until now, perhaps you've felt what this story wants to say. Speak up while there's still time. Listen when someone is struggling. Let the truth step into the light before it turns into a darkness no one can escape. And above all, remember this. Sometimes, justice is not an ending. It is the beginning of healing, the beginning of a new life, where buried things are finally laid down gently, like a breeze passing over an old porch, leaving us with the lesson that humans were never meant to carry forever the things they cannot put into words.